What's good with you two? It's a convict perspective with your boy Flacco.
Hey, and your homie Rojo.
So today we're going to be discussing an issue that affects the communities. And what we're going to be doing is a four-part series on Nuestra Familia prison gang organization. And what we're going to do in order for us to get a better understanding of how this organization has affected the communities and the wreckage it has caused, we're going to first discuss the first part of this series is going to be on the history. The second part we're going to be discussing is its insurgents in Northern California and its control. The third part, we're going to discuss the wreckage and the destruction the NF has caused in these inner city communities in Northern California. In the fourth part, we're going to talk about where we see the future of the NF is going, ideals and solutions for the community to basically try to take a stance against the continuance of gang violence and gang wreckage in the communities. So in order for us to get a better understanding of this, I think it's real important for the listeners out there to get a better understanding of the cause of where the NF came about, how its expulsion occurred, and where it all started in the beginning. So I'm going to let Rojo discuss this.
Okay, there's a lot of different documentations and channels and videos about, the history of the MA, the history of the NF. But, some of them, are 100% incorrect. Some of them are partly correct. But what I got here is all information that has been obtained through court documents, legal transcripts, and by members who were there when it happened. So with that in mind, man, I'll break this down a little bit. Basically, in 1955, the MA forms, and it was all LA area gang members. And they went on to recruit solidly and, became large in numbers and were able to control all of California Department of Corrections for around 10 years without any problems. Come mid-60s, like 1965 or so, a lot of the Latinos on the yard were tired of being, mistreated and abused by the MA, and they had become very powerful and they were very deep. And, they controlled Quentin, Folsom, Soledad, Vacaville, Susanville. And, a few guys had got together, on the under and said, hey, we need to take a stand against this. So they slowly started recruiting and organizing, but they did so like real secretively, very clandestine. And they could not afford to kick off problems right then because they weren't deep enough, organized enough. You know what I mean? They weren't experienced enough yet to take on, the MA, who was very powerful, and they'd been running stuff for a long time. So they had a lot of advantages in tactics and, planning and stuff like that. So some of the original founding fathers of what would eventually become La Nuestra Familia, which was formerly called La Familia, Blooming Flower, Familia Cinco, a bunch of different names, but they were all inmates from Southern California. And they consisted of some guys, John Valdez, Little John from Little Valley, Jesse Valenzuela, Black Jess from Chiques, Gonzalo Hernandez, Chalo from Bakersfield. The first white NF member was Bruce Morgan, Weddle from Westside Clanton, Freddie Gonzalez was from San Diego, Chalo's from Bakersfield, pardon me, Death Row Joe Gonzalez from Chiques, and Robert Babo Sosa from Santa Barbara, who is commonly thought to have been the first NF member to kill a Mexican mafia member. Although at the time, claims were made that his victim was merely an associate of the MA, our history has taught us different. The incident in question that I'm talking about is a result of the Shoe Wars, which is one of the main factors in the September 16, 1968 all-out assault. And that occurred in the Alpine section of the South Block in San Quentin. The NF had planned to rush the MA on Mexican Independence Day so as hopefully to catch them slipping, drunk, relaxed, celebrating, etc. And the end result being that 7 MA members were stabbed and 1 member by the name of Archie Gallegos was killed. Now, in other people's history, it says that he was merely an associate. However, we had a friend that we still talk to who was there. And, knowing how we get down, or my former organization got down, we're not going to waste the manpower hitting somebody who's just a tag along. You know what I mean? We're gonna go after who we need to go after, period. If you're gonna strike, you gotta strike at the head of the snake, or you're gonna come up short. But needless to say, the NF quickly took over control of San Quentin after that, and the prison officials scrambled to get all the MA members out of general population and get them into administrative seg. And so Death Row Joe Gonzalez is the author of the first Nuestra Familia Constitution, which was written in 1972. And that's also when La Familia became Nuestra Familia. In December 17th of 72 is when Cheyenne Rudy Cadena was killed by Nuestra Familia in Palm Hall in Chino State Prison. He was stabbed by a guy called Manzana and a couple others. He was stabbed over 70 times before he was thrown from the third tier, and he was dead before he hit the floor. Tiny Contreras continued stabbing him, sort of as a show of superior killing power, which is a concept ingrained in Familiano training. Prior to that, the Aryan Brotherhood and the Mexican Mafia were, making plans to join forces, so to speak. So on April 21st of 1972, the two Aryan Brotherhood members, Fred Mendrin and Donnie Ray Hale, acting on behalf of the Mexican Mafia, killed an NF member named Fred Castillo. This was done by them to garner favor with the MA, and because the MA knew that the white inmates would have a better chance to surprise their target than would an MA member. A few months later, Glenn Hobo Holden and Felix Fig Avalos, Nuestra Familia members, killed Stephen Hadley, an Aryan Brotherhood member, in retaliation for the murder of Fred Castillo. Bear in mind, some other things transpired, you know what I mean? But I'm not here to elaborate on the history of either the Aryan Brotherhood or the Mexican Mafia. I'm only discussing the Nuestra Familia. And when either one of these other group segments happen to be involved, I will mention them, obviously. But in doing our research, we came across a manuscript that was from the chairman of the Board of Corrections. It's the NCJRS, which I believe is the National Criminal Justice Records, something or other, and it's dated March 30th of 1979, and it was a briefing document for the Board of Corrections, which shows, the murders of prisoners by prison gangs. And there's a little graph on there that shows the really bloody years that we had in our history, 75, 76, and 77. In 75, it shows the NF as having 0 kills. In 76, it shows 5. And in 77, it shows 12. During the same period, in 1975, the Mexican Mafia also had 0. In 76, it shows that they had 1, and in 77, 3. As far as the BGF goes, they had 1 in 75, and the Aryan Brotherhood had 2 confirmed in 1977. These were the years of great sacrifice and determination, and shortly thereafter, all Mexican Mafia and NF members were sent straight to ADSEG once they were identified. Pardon me for the shuffling of notes and stuff, but a lot of these dates and some of the statistics are hard to remember, and I want to make sure I give it to you accurately. And maybe Flacco, I've gone over this a little bit, in these years right here, but if you have anything that I missed that was, relevant to these years of our former organization, could you give us your input on that?
Well, you know what? It's kind of interesting because I'm a firm believer that all history may be distorted, you know what I'm saying? But there's some relevant facts, and I will say this: in reading Mundo's from Altar Boy to Hitman, his history is pretty accurate about everything he's stating. My only issue with Mundo is that only one MA member was killed. That's a big issue because I talked to NF members who were present that were recruited as NF members at the same time that he was recruited as a Mexican Mafia member.
Hey, Flacco, to add to that, man, me and you both recently just met an individual who got one himself.
Oh, yeah.
That's one right there besides Cheyenne that we've read his paperwork on, and it was definitely a validated member, and our buddy that we talked to was also a validated member. So, I mean, we're just trying to throw out our version of it so nobody's hearing, how more dominant one group was over the other. We're going to give it to you real by people who were there and by documentation only.
And this same individual did say that Mundo's account of the history was pretty damn accurate, is what he did say.
Yeah, he did a good job.
So there's no issues or conflict. Like some people think we're against Mundo and all that. But the thing is, we are in disagreement about only one Mexican Mafia member being killed. So I'm going to break down a little bit of how things have been told to me. And so I was always told 1957 is where the MA was formed in DVI, around 55, 57, by Weddle Buff Flores, and it was to be a super gang. And as that came about, they became powerful. And a lot of them started catching cases and going to prison, and they started to recruit. And what came about being organized for the people, because at that time there was no gangs in prison. You were just a old school convict. You know, it was a whole crazy game. People were getting raped, they were getting killed, they were getting extorted, all this crazy stuff. And so it formed to protect the people, from my understanding. And from there, anytime you become too powerful of an organization, the first thing we start to do is we start to oppress our own people. And so from my understanding, a lot of ex-MA members used to oppress people that were from rural areas like San Diego, Oxnard, Ontario, Fresno, all these different areas. And that a lot of people got tired of the MA oppression. They were forcing them to have their old ladies bring dope in. They were taking them for their canteen. Some of them were even getting raped and being prostituted out. And a lot of people, Mexicans at that time, decided that, you know what, we're tired of this oppression. And you had different types of organizations, you know, that or uprisings that were occurring. You had the Blooming Flower, you had the Familia Cinco, and they started to network and organize together. And my understanding is in San Quentin, under the guise of a heritage program where Rasa can go to discuss Chicano studies, that they started to meet in there and they just started to discuss ways to fight back against MA aggression. And so that's how it all initially started. They started to have skirmishes in Soledad, a couple incidents that occurred. And we all know about the shoe incident with Robot Salas and who was the individual that got his shoes took?
Oh, man, I'd have to think about that for a second.
So all that incident occurred. And in our history, it's called the straw that broke the camel's back. And that's when the NF decided what we call the expulsion of the NF was born. Where that attack was called the All-Out Blitz. And after that, you had the 5-year war from 1968 to 1972. A lot of NF members, Diamond got killed out there in Susanville, Tehachapi, and there was conflict going on, but there was also supposed to be an alleged truce that was in the workings. Cheyenne was ahead of his time. And from every NF member that I discussed this issue with, they have all said the same thing, that Cheyenne really did want to create that peace. But as those brothers that were there in Chino, 2 of them got stabbed, and they kept on hearing these incidents. So, you know, you can have reprisals actions. And so one thing that a lot of the people don't know about the killing of Cheyenne, that you guys are all going to be shocked about. One of the pieces that was made was used from a typewriter piece that came from a Hell's Angel that was locked up.
Oh, hey, excuse me to interrupt, but the individual that got his shoes took, his name was Hector Padilla.
Okay.
He was just he wasn't a Nuestra Familia member. He was kind of like, you know, an associate basically. He was just northern, you know, basically, you know, this is before Norteños, but he would just have been a Norteño at that point.
Yeah, I think he loaned him to who? Carlos Ortega? Is that who he loaned?
Yeah, that's Pieface.
Yeah, Pieface. Yeah. I believe that's from the history I was told.
Correct.
So yeah, back to that typewriter piece. It was actually one of the pieces that was used to kill Cheyenne came from a Hell's Angel. And it said, you know, in our history, it said that he was stabbed 70 times and he was already dead before he hit the floor. And just for good measure, one last hit was stabbed in his heart. And see, another incident that I want to talk about, this came right straight from those Department of Justice transcripts. Okay, I'm going to read this as follows. Rafael Ernesto Gabriel was convicted of first-degree murder for the stabbing death of Alejandro Moreno. Art Beltran and Richard Dean Castro were convicted of accessory after the fact to murder. Moreno was murdered by Gabriel because he was a member of the Mexican Mafia. Again, Moreno was murdered by Gabriel because he was a member of the Mexican Mafia. The evidence showed that all defendants belonged to Nuestra Familia, which keeps a list of all known Mexican Mafia members for the purpose of executing them on site. The convictions occurred in December of 1977, and all 3 were sentenced to prison in January 1978. Now I'm going to elaborate on who that individual was. Okay, Alejandro Moreno was an MA member named Knuckles. He paroled from Soledad in 1977, and they ended up killing him at a bus depot. That's a confirmed fact. I've actually been told this by an ex-NF member who was present at that time, who was active at that time. And so there's no, like I said, everybody wants confirmed reports and transcripts when it comes to the death of an MA member. I'm giving you one. We just gave you the resources, the case file, and all that. So that's one murder that happened, but there's been numerous others. I've been told by an NF member that was recruited in 1971 who's still alive to this day. He says there was about 12 NF members that were killed and about 6 or 7 MA members that were killed in this war. So like all causes, right? All movements, you know what I mean? They all have to become self-supportive. And I say around 1974, 75 is when the NF first started its first regiment. And from my understanding, from the history that's been told to me, that was being ran by crackers. And that was around 75 where they became extremely active. And what the NF used to focus on was taxing drug dealers, taxing prostitutes, and doing armed robberies, doing whatever they can.
Robbing drug dealers?
Yeah. And at that time, when the NF had this first set quota, what they were expecting from NF members that were paroling was they wanted them to contribute $100 a day. Now, let's bear in mind, this was 1975. $100 a day if you were an NF member out there on the streets. And what they came to realize is that wouldn't be attainable. So what they started to implement at that time was two big things. They started to sit there and say that they wanted all NF members to contribute 50% of any type of crimes that they committed. And they also enforced the no drug usage. So as this started to occur, there was a lot of murders that were happening. I think besides the murders that we listed that were gang related, there was a lot of NF on NF killings. You know, a lot of people were getting whacked because they were using dope or they were coming out to the streets and they weren't handling their business. And NF became to be known as the most violent and treacherous organization. There's an article on them on Times Magazine listing them as the most recognized as the most powerful organization. And a lot of that had to do with the killings that they were committing within their own people. Now, around that time, you had a big issue that was occurring around 1980, 1981. And that's after the NF finally got indicted, like in the late 70s. I don't know the official date, but there were some issues going on with Black Bob. With Black Bob, but also regarding Babo Sosa and Death Row Joe. Babo was being scrutinized because at that time he was the NF general. But from previous members that I've discussed about this whole situation, they said that the biggest issue that we had within the NF's old constitution at that time, right, was that the first captain, who was Death Row Joe, had the ultimate authority to manage things such as money, killings, and all that. And a lot of things that he used to be doing was basically, how do you call that? He was trying to protect himself, his own interest. And a lot of that fell upon Babo. Now, we also heard from Sundown, he discussed about how Babo had a brother whacked and then got with his lady. And there was issues about money that was misappropriated at that time. So there was a big issue. And a lot of the NF members that were pushing it was Black Bob from Sanjo. I mean, no, not from Sanjo. Black Bob from Gilroy. And Conejo from Santa Clara. And so at that time, what they tried to do is you had two organizations that were in conflict with each other. At that time, Bob had been impeached. I think Big had became the general on one side of the NF. And on the other side, you had Black Bob and Conejo that were restructuring the whole organization. And what they came up with was a whole different type of chain of command. An organization and governing body. And the Mesa. And you had a conflict between the two NFs that was going on for about a year, I believe. And then that war ended. And in the aftermath of that, the new CAT system, CAT 3, CAT 1, CAT 2, CAT 3, the captains, the new generals, and they had different titles at that time for it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was when they started the Nuestro General with the Cacique and the Teniente. I think that's what it was, if that's when the OGB and the Mesa came out. But yeah, it switched from a more of a military structure to more, you know, I mean, it's still military ranks, but it was just ran differently. Instead of having one general, you know, there was 3 separate generals with different divisions that they were responsible for, all with the equal vote. But, you know, a majority rules kind of thing. And, you know, it changed a lot of the way to get rid of any kind of sole dictatorship or any kind of abuse of power, because each office of the general was kind of there to check the other, so to speak. You know what I mean? And, you know, then they had the 10 captains that were brought in, you know, so you had captains 1 through 10, with the lower number being the next captain who would step up to the plate as a general in case of a parole, a death, a defection of some sort. And so the captains also, they were in on a lot of the voting too at that time. You know what I mean? Where sometimes it would have to be a 2/3 majority of captains for certain, laws to be passed or rules to be implemented.
Even recruitment too.
Yeah, back then you used to have a lot of say so in your recruitment. When I got recruited, I was sponsored by one guy and approved by another guy. I don't really know the process if it went by the Constitution just because of who recruited me, which was the highest ranking member at the time. So I don't know if he had to necessarily play by the rules or if he did or didn't. I'm not sure. My recruitment just got approved pretty quick. You know what I mean? So they changed a lot of things, man, and a lot of it was for the better, and that's just to keep everybody, honest, and instead of allowing people to have hidden agendas that, might only be self-serving.
Yeah, and at that time, we started to see the emergence of the Norteño collective out there on these lines. Around the same time all this conflict was going on with the NF, you had many that walked away, and after the dust was settled, they had what you call a re-entry. But from my understanding, nobody ever re-entered back. Whoever walked away, they walked away on their own terms.
There was no reprisals for that either, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
I don't think there was reprisals, but...
Not unless they went out with something else attached to that.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was. I haven't heard any different anyway.
Yeah. So how the Norteños and Sureños came about was basically between this NF-MA war. You know what I'm saying? The MA at that time, this is how we've been taught. Everybody's going to have different things that they've been told, but this is coming from the NF Norteño side. That back in the late 70s, because the NF was becoming so strong on these lines, controlling things in Tracy and different facilities. And MA had Folsom in their facility as well, but they still had sleepers at that time that were on these lines.
Yeah, on both sides.
On both sides, who were MA members, but trying to portray that they were just civilians on the line and stuff, but they were secretly recruiting. And so what the MA did was the best thing that they could do was cause this divergence between North and South. Because at that time, the NF had a lot of regiments down there in San Diego, Chino. According to Bo told me that they had a lot of Black Angels that were running under them as well. A whole lot of Southern Hoods. And you also had MA members that were from up north too. Yeah. You know what I mean? Hatcha is one of them.
Yeah. He's from San Francisco, right?
Yeah, he's from Frisco. So what the MA started to do, this is what we've been taught, was they told us that the MA started a rumor that the NF were Norteños. So they started to unite these Sureños under their bandera, right? Representing that 13. And what they were doing on these lines was they were doing the MA bidding. So if you were from up north and you were just a regular dude doing your time, you started being targeted and victimized. And at that time, a lot of the NF members were being locked down in K-Wing around that time. Yeah. And different facilities, they were all slammed down. They were being moved around. And what they started to do is they started to educate these Norteños that came back there to the hole. You know what I'm saying? At that time, I think Skip was one of them that was in Tracy around 82, I believe, or 81. So he was one of the first Norteños that was pushing that line. And what they were doing was they were educating them. And they had a mandatory policy that if you left from the DVI hole and you were a Norteño, right, which is they started to take that title on, you had a 90-day policy to go out there and handle your business, right? Now, this is the first time that they started to create the bonds at that time. This is before even Nuestra Raza. And so my understanding, when they created the bonds, the first Norteños, was they gave them these 14 bonds and for different direction for them to govern themselves when they were out there on these main lines and receptions, so they can basically start to splurge everywhere and just spread. And at that time, they gave them the title XIV, which was for the 14 bonds, and structure because now they were organized. XIV structure Norteños. So a lot of times people say, oh yeah, the structure was man-made by CDC. No, we were actually calling them structure before we came up with the Nuestra Raza. Now, nothing had been imposed. They tried to implement a new movement and faction at that time, but it got shut down. So the bonds were remodified, and you had the people that wrote the bonds were Brownbaugh from Morgan Hill, Gopas from Salinas, and Corney from Woodland, right? And on January 22nd, 1984, the expulsion of the Nuestra Raza came about. And that's when you started to hear the terms bro and hermano. And basically, even the NR, people forget this too. The Nuestra Raza even had its own cat system back then.
Yeah, the reason that date is the start of the Nuestra Raza being, January 22nd of 84 is one of the very first people in that group was killed in New Folsom. He was shot by the guards.
Palo.
Yes.
Palo from Sakura.
So that was given, to honor his memory for being, a complete savage. They went ahead and used that to launch that as the official birth date of that organization.
So as I discussed, the Nuestra Raza started as a farm team basically for the NF. They were sub-faction. They had their own recruiting tools, the recruitment process. And basically what the NF had when they recruited the Nuestra Raza and established them, it was basically to be a recruiting pool for future members and to take care of their bidding on these lines. And with that, the Nuestra Raza became basically pretty strong behind the walls. You had basically NR members that were establishing regiments out there on the streets. They started to kind of go a little bit rogue. And with that, around the 1990s, things started to change because they started coming up with the validation process of validating them as Northern Structure members. And so what you had at that time is you had the ones that were really solid NR members, they started to get validated. And the ones that were left out there on these main lines, either they were what you would call renegades, that were there for their own selfish purposes. They wanted to establish a yard so they could use drugs and enjoy the benefits and privileges. Or you had other NR members that were younger in their careers and they were basically blind to what the cause of struggle was about. And so you had a lot of misconceptions of what was really going on behind the walls. And so the NF started to notice that, that they had gave the NR too much authority. And the ones that were being left out there were not handling business like they were supposed to.
Yeah, one of the real problems that they had with the Nuestra Raza was the numbers. They were recruiting like insane amounts of people. I mean, there was a lot of homeboy favoritism in their recruiting. So like if your homeboy was a bro and you ran into him somewhere, be it the county jail or, prison, and you wanted to, take that step just for personal gain, basically, because you get a lot of juice with being a member of that organization as well, because with all the Nuestra Familia members being in the shoe, the NR members were basically the bosses usually wherever they went, unless, they were in an ad seg yard with NF members waiting to go to the Bay or Corcoran or whatnot. But they had a lot of juice, man, and they were running things on the behalf of the NF. So what you had was mass recruiting, and it would, at times it would just be like one bro and another bro sponsoring you and just saying, hey, you're in. The process, there wasn't a lot of vetting in the process. So all kinds of people that, if there was NF members there to check this individual's conduct and, their potential for excellence, that never, ever would have got pulled in. I mean, you're pulling in level 1, auto theft type of dudes and expecting them to be, gangster, with the business and professional. And there was just so many ridiculous amounts of bros being pulled that the NF lost track and weren't able to implement, their policies and their will on this group.
And at that time, the NF was basically, they had gone underground. A lot of them, I think before the Bay opened, a lot of them were being transferred out to Tehachapi Shoes, from my understanding. And so a lot of these directives and orders that were coming out to the streets around 1989, they wanted to start taking care of business. And one of the first regions that they started to focus on again was the San Jose area. And at that time, that's when you had the major indictment that happened around 92, 93, when the NF, I think they killed about, 11 people out there on the streets, I believe.
It was a lot.
It was a lot. And that goes back to what I've told in previous stories, that back in the days, the NF used to take care of their own business out there in the regiments. You know what I'm saying? Even to kill another NF member, it would have to be done by an NF member.
Right.
You wouldn't hire out no NR member or no North Daniel. Yeah, some of them were allowed to function with the regiments, and that was a select few. They had a probationary period when you would step out, and you would have to establish a job, get parole off your behind, do everything that you would expect from a normal civilian to avoid detection from law enforcement. So in the 90s, when a lot of NF members were paroling, you had Louis Dump Truck Chavez, Ronnie Shelton, Bobby Lopez, Silent, Huevo Treque, Spinkio,
Cerna.
Cerna. All these individuals came out, and they were under direct orders to just start taking out NF Hermits, and to start establishing the San Jose Regiment. And they went out there and they handled business.
Yeah, they
You know what I mean? They took out a whole lot. If you weren't paying rent to the NF, they were handling business. And what led to that was a major, major indictment at that time. And I think one of the ones that flipped in that indictment was was it Chente Orojo?
Yes, I think, I'm not sure if it was that one or not. Was it? That was the June of '92 one, I believe.
Yeah.
With the 21 individuals being
And
indicted.
I think
that was June 1st, '92.
I think he was an OGB sitting member at the time too. I think, if I'm not correct.
I believe you are correct.
You know what I mean? So he all got indicted. Flaco Parajo, Vargas, Eddie Vargas, all these individuals got indicted. Cripple Jerry, and it put a big what do you call stain on San Jose, because you had so many people flipping at that time. And that's when the direction of all these changes came about afterwards. After they got sentenced around 96 or 97 to death row, some of them took life sentences, and you had Ronnie Shelton flip, you had Dump Truck, all these individuals flipped and turned. The whole organization in San Jose, started to succumb. It started to be affected. It was no longer had the reputation like it once had. And so at the same time, you also had all these new changes at the time when you had the dismantling of the Nuestra Raza, which they started to put into works around 1995, but they made it official in April of 97. And it took years for that filter to get filtered out to all the main lines and for a lot of NR members to get in line.
I was there when they were starting to first disband it. I was right there, and I was actually asked my opinion of that whole situation, whether I thought it was a good idea or not. And I told them straight up no. And another thing on that whole San Jose indictment on June 1st of '92 is that that's what caused brass to decide, from now on, each regiment's going to function independently. We're not going to have, a RSD in this area and a RSD in that area, sharing the same ventures, which are what we call part of, the way we make money. They're called ventures. There's 13 illegal ventures that we partake in. And all the stuff that was going on there, that's when they really started to clamp down. Like, each little area that's controlled by one person is going to be totally independent of everybody else and not rely on them, not share resources, etc., because of all the problems that had came out of San Jose at that time.
Yeah. And at that time, that's when they started to, make different changes as far as the GUNCD, and, they started allowing other individuals who were lower caliber individuals to function within these regiments. You could be a Northerner or Norteño, and the title that they would give you would be an NF associate. And if you were functioning with a street crew, right, under a regiment, you held the same rank and status as an NF member, but you were not technically an NF member. It was basically called an NF associate, kind of like how the mob structure is, where you have the Italian mob, you have your captains and soldiers, and then you have your associates. So the NF had that same thing, and their whole agenda was, if we can utilize more manpower as tools out there, we're going to generate a lot more income.
Yeah, that took away the selectiveness in the process of letting someone function in your regiment. They lost sight of basically quality over quantity, and that led to a lot of problems, allowing a lot of people without the proper training that haven't been in them adsegs and them shoes for many years to study the correct approaches to these ventures. And it was just a recipe for disaster. When you're putting out, that's like sending a kid from, high school to start for an NFL team, man. There's gonna be bad news that comes out of it.
Yeah. You also had a couple major murders that happened at that time that really transcended and had a very detrimental effect on the outlook of where this organization was going. You had the MC murder.
Yeah, a major event in our history.
And people do not understand how much effect that had, because, this dude had been within the organization, I think, he must have had about a 25, 27-year career, you know what I'm saying, as an NF member. And from people that I know him, there's not one bad thing that they could say about the man.
During my career, there was 3 major incidents, the Maquillo incident being one, the D facility dilemmas being 2, and then the Black Widow being number 3. And those are 3 things that really, really destroyed any momentum that the Nuestra Familia had going for them.
And they all happened in subsequent fashion of each other.
Real fast, yeah. 98 to what? Tibbs and them pled guilty in September of 04.
Yeah,
so, I mean, we're only talking 6 years total.
Yeah, so you had we didn't even touch on that. So you had Big Smiley, who's trying to label himself as boss of bosses.
Yeah.
You know, and
Bandera,
who, you know, in a lot of ways, Bandera was what he was advocating was the right thing, but he just went about it the whole wrong ways, from what I heard. And you know, you talk about Cafe, which is Brown Bob. You know, I've heard different theories about that whole issue, that he didn't really voice his opinion. You know what I'm saying? And that was one of the major things. But I personally think, and I've discussed this with other brothers, right? And let's bear in mind, you know, this is brass business at that time. You know what I'm saying? I wasn't even part of the organization or affiliated with it at that time.
I was only a Cat 1.
And you're not going to be told why something happens. But if you sit there and just analyze it, and you have any type of intelligence, you know it was a power play. You know, let's get rid of Brown Bob. You know what I'm saying?
No question.
You know, because he was one of the longest sitting members. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, the tattoo, I think, was a big issue too, when he covered up that tattoo and he started speaking at these engagements. Because if you're going to do that, you know, I think that was just the excuse to hit him. You know what I'm saying? And so they used that as a pinpoint to sit there and say, oh, if he's doing this, he may end up telling.
Right.
You know, and as well as the thing with Big Smiley. So Brown Bob was always very influential out there in the streets and always voiced his opinion. You know what I'm saying? Look what he did with old man Rafaz. He had him hit without any approval.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? With no consequences for old man trying to establish that peace treaty. So Brown Bob, even though he was doing all those things, he wasn't a voice that wasn't going to be heard.
You know, I got the whole, you know, yeah, I get it with Brown Bob. I got the whole thing about Big Smiley, man. I was actually in San Quentin on the 6 yard with him, and, you know, a bunch of other C's, Boxer from Frisco and Chico and Chante DK. There was maybe 2 more. And, you know, I got that hard-headedness out of him. You know what I mean? I talked to him a few times, man, because he used to trip on me because I was so young and so non-Latino looking. And he took an interest in me, man, but I could tell he didn't really have no give in him. So, you know, I seen what happened, you know, per the rules of the Constitution. Once he left Pelican Bay, he had to relinquish his position, you know, and that's just based on paperwork. You know, that's nothing personal. That's just how the chain of command works. If you leave headquarters, the next person in line steps up to fill your position, and you have to go back through the cycle again to get another shot at that position. And, you know, I could just see that, you know, he wasn't about to give no ground, man. And that created a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, between C facility, D facility, different neighborhoods, different allegiances and loyalties.
You had bros that were being put into this mix. And that's the thing, that after the Black Widow indictments, that they tried to come out, they said, you know, don't meddle in NF business. And this is anything for any Northerners or Norteños. It's kind of hard because you got the current federal situation. But, you know, say you're in a block, you're in like D7, you know what I'm saying, with this individual who's loyal to Big Smiley. And we've been taught to follow under the umbrella of the NF, to follow our authorities and our leadership.
We follow the Constitution, not an individual.
Right. So as a bro, though, if you're told, okay, go over here, when you get over here, hit this dude because he's loyal to Big Smiley, and you're with Bandera, what do you do as a bro? You're going to follow the authority in charge, which is the C that's telling you to do this. So it put a lot of brothers in bad situations, you know. There was a couple of brothers that were put in cells that were told to, didn't one of them actually hit Bandera in a cell, or was it Big Smiley?
I think it was Charlie O that, man.
Or was it, I think, wasn't it Mike, Little Mike Heel?
Man, I don't remember.
It was someone from the East Bay.
We'll figure that out, though.
You know what I mean? Sure. But I also know that I think it was Zebop.
I remember Zebop, yeah.
Wasn't he supposed to hit Big Smiley
I believe,
in the cell?
Yeah, I think you're right, man.
And he locked it up over that. So, you know what I mean? Because this was his big homie. So, you know, and so if you take action towards another C, you know, like I talk about an incident with Mark Rodriguez, Caja, right? When he was doing like PC moves, right? But until it would be confirmed by brass that he was expelled from the organization, if any of us in our members would have hit him on that yard, we would have all been deemed no good. So a lot of these bros were being put into these situations, and there's brothers to this day that were solid. They committed their life to the NR, and they got deemed no good over the D facility dilemmas.
Yeah, I don't think it was Charlie O that did something. I think he was supposed to do something actually, and it never transpired. I know he was involved in either a plot or a failed plot, but I don't remember the actual outcome of what he did.
I think it was Lil Mike Heel from Dakota, who's only about 4'10", so I don't know why they.
On Big Smiley?
No, on Pantera.
Oh, okay. I've never seen Pantera in real life. I know Big Smiley. He's a big boy, so that'd be a handful.
Well, Z-Pop was a big dude too.
Yeah, no, he was a monster.
You know, I mean, he passed away, by the way, too.
When was that?
2003, I think. Heroin
overdose.
It's been
that long?
2004, heroin overdose. Yeah, he got caught up in that situation. So, you know, because he didn't want to move on Big Smiley.
Yeah, I remember reading a filter about that.
Yeah. So, back to what we're talking about, though. Those were all the issues that were the organization. Then they got indicted under Operation Black Widow. You had the MC and Brown Bob murder, and the Operation Black Widow is another interesting thing in our history. You know, that's caused a lot of turmoil. You know, and you can speak on what you went through during that time period.
Yeah, no doubt. I actually got I got out of Pelican Bay in September of '96. And unbeknownst to me, as soon as I left there, they allowed me to get on the Greyhound back then. That was before they did the courtesy paroles. And from the time I got into San Francisco and over to the Concord parole office, as soon as I left there, I was under 24-hour surveillance for, I don't know, man, I think I was out maybe 5 months without any violations. And they had me under surveillance the whole time, and I had no clue. You know what I mean? I was doing major things out there, like I can't even explain. We were getting it, you know. So they were following me the whole time, man. They could have ran up on me numerous times and had me. And you know, fortunately for me, they never caught me doing anything or linked to anything really treacherous that they'd really try to make an example out of me for. But you know, they knew I was the OGB, the RSD, whatever you wanted to call it, regiment commander for a vast area inside of the Bay Area. And they knew what I was up to, man. They knew everything, man. You know, they tried to come see me at Santa Rita, and during one of the visits, they came during normal visit hours, and then they said, no, your visit's in there in the attorney room. And I'm like, oh, no, it's not good. And the FBI and SSU came, and they started trying to ask me a bunch of questions, and I was playing dumb. And they started pulling out pictures. Like, they'd ask me if I knew people, and I'd be like, no, I never heard of them. They'd pull out pictures with me and that person in many different cities all over the Bay Area, in nightclubs, inside of stores like Macy's and stuff like that, inside of recording studios. And they were on me, man. And they had already had so much information, man. They left folders open, you know, intentionally for me to see, you know, what people were saying about me and this and that, and trying to proposition me, you know, to flip and whatnot. And man, they had so much evidence, man. I'm trying to remember. I want to say this is 1990, maybe early 97 when this transpired, before I had caught another case. And, you know, I blew them off. You know what I mean? They knew I was BSing them 100%. And, you know, they probably caught me in 100 lies, you know, while they were trying to talk to me. I thought I was smart enough to talk my way out of stuff. But, man, they already had everything they needed based on, you know, Lizard's cooperation. But, you know, they were just trying to see what they could get me to say, you know, to further their case against the NF, man. And, man, it was a trippy time, man. You know, they actually ended up saving me from a robbery charge, because I had been identified out of a photo lineup, man, as robbing a store at gunpoint, and I didn't do it. And, you know, man, I went to the parole office, they snatched me up, didn't tell me nothing, took me to Martinez, and they told me that I was being held on a robbery, that I'd been ID'd out of a photo lineup. And so I go through there, and I'm like, wow, this is crazy. I get to Santa Rita, because I used to send all the violators from the Bay Area to Rita at the time. And I go to my Morrissey hearing in Valdivia now, the same thing. I go to my Morrissey hearing, and they're asking me about this robbery, and I'm like, I didn't do it. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm just like, man, I'm about to get railroaded on some drama. And the FBI, they got a knock on the door, and the FBI lady came in and swore under oath that I was under surveillance in Antioch at the time. And I'm just like, oh man, this is crazy. So they ended up saving me, but at the same time, my involvement with them is kind of what helped seal the end of my career. Although I didn't say anything about any kind of crimes or anything, I did go outside and say some things that I shouldn't have per the rules, man. But it was more of a rule violation than anything else.
Yeah, so without going into too much details at the post-Black Widow, right? There's been numerous indictments. January 19th of 82, 25 federal indictments. 6/1/92, 21 federal indictments. 6/2/94, 8 federal indictments. I think that's Mad Dog actually from Stockton at that time. 8/19/98 is when Mike Hill was killed. Brown Bob was killed April 20th, 1999. And the whole original indictment of the Operation Black Widow was April 20th, 2001. What a trip. That's 2 years after Brown Bob was murdered. In addition to that, Tibbs, Pinky, Quete, Corny, Stork, Happy, all of them pled guilty 9/27/2004. And here we have the NF has continued its tyranny over Northern California. There's a current situation of anti-hostilities, and there's also a federal-state conflict, but we're going to go into that later on in details of that situation.
Would you say the Black Widow indictment was the single most crippling incident to happen in the history of the NF?
The most crippling? I would have to say that's probably one of the major ones out of all of them.
In my opinion, that would be the number one most devastating.
Because we're still seeing the adverse effects of it to this day right now.
And how many years has it been?
It's been 19 years. Yeah. The feds, the guys that are in the feds, right? We're going to go into the state-federal conflict later on. But these guys are relentless. But then again, they're all outdated. They think it's 1984.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They think we're still capable of doing armored car robberies and stuff like that.
That's what I tried to tell them when I was getting schooled on my street ventures. It's like, it's not the same, gentlemen. You do an armored car, now you're definitely getting a shootout. You can grab a courier, as he's going in or out of a store, but like trying to take on the armored car itself with the technology nowadays, it's just not wise.
Well, that's why Bird and Happy. Well, that's another indictment that happened in 2012.
Yeah,
Bird from Salinas and Happy from Lodi. They just got out of that Black Widow and they came out like they were regulating like it was the 70s again.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
Trying to go to the store and extort cashiers.
I mean, what else did they do? They did Happy killed 2 people, then had some youngsters go over there and burnt the whole house down.
Yeah,
then they killed another dude that just got out. You know what I'm saying? From the feds, and
like they're with the business.
Yeah, they are. They definitely with the business, man. And without elaborating too much on the federal state thing, it's going to be very interesting, man.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying. But they're all getting old. You know what I'm saying. But I think they got one person. If to keep the federal faction going, Skip.
Yeah, I agree.
And all these recruiting process of all these new guys, but all these guys that are in there, man, all these C's that like we all know, like Wino Gallegos from Salinas and Bubba from Salas and all these individuals, they're in their 40s.
Yeah. But
they're not getting out for another 30 years.
Yeah. Yeah, me and Wino are the same age. He was my celly in Pelican Bay.
Yeah. I think he got 33 years.
Oh, we.
Bandit from Watsonville, I know him too. But from all these individuals, man, they're all doing a lot of time, man.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So the organization's been crippled. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Indictment after indictment. So they're even to the extent to where in San Jose, they've recently indicted hoods that were working under the NF.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So now you got homeboys out there in the streets that they need to think twice before they decide if they want to work with the regiment.
Yeah.
No one wants to work with the regiment.
No.
You know what I'm saying? No, if you do, it's because you're more worried about what your ego and what people, you want to have that recognition. But if you want that recognition, expect to be indicted in 10, 20 years. And either you're going to...
If that. Yeah,
you know what I mean?
If that. Yeah.
And either you're going to flip or you're going to... You know what I'm saying?
The life expectancy for being a Familiano has fallen tremendously, since, its inception. Back then you'd have a career until, you got murdered. You know what I mean? Nowadays, your time frame's short, man. You run out of time quick jumping in that life, man, unless you're a lifer.
Yeah. So now you got 2 factions, though, that's going on. That's where we are today in 2020. You got the state faction, which... Believe it or not, two of the OGB members are from Southern California.
Yeah.
DC from Chino, and then people don't realize James Conejo Perez, he's originally from Sakura. From LA. Yeah. But he caught his case in Sacramento. So to this day,
yeah, there's still a stronghold of Southern gente in the organization. You know, Tarzan just passed away.
Yeah,
that was another old school Southern boy.
All right, YouTube. We're gonna end it here. This is our first installment. Like I said, we're gonna have 3 other episodes to follow. We're gonna have the insurgents of the NF's control over Northern California. I think that's gonna be a big topic about how the Norteños have played a factor out here on the streets, and how the NF has gained that control and that momentum. Then we're going to talk about the destruction and wreckage, that's caused onto families by our activities out here on the streets. And then we're going to be talking about different ideals, different solutions, and where we see this going in the future. You know what I mean? So part of our thing when we're doing these videos is to try to convey a message for the community, and try to focus on what type of change. You know what I mean? The more information people have, the more they can make changes within themselves and try to live a whole better life.
Also, on this this video we just did about the history, I mean, we only had 40, 50 minutes, so it's pretty general, so if any of the listeners have a specific question, it's real hard to remember every single event off the top of your head. But if anybody out there has specific questions, go ahead and shoot them, and we either have the answer for you or we'll ascertain it, a honest, truthful answer that has been researched fully.
With that said, hit the like and subscribe button.
Have a good day, YouTube.